Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Romina Ichon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim and I, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. So, Tim, how's your Christmas season been so far? Are you getting all of your presents and all that good stuff done?
I'm done buying everything, and I
Oh
spent
my!
all day Saturday wrapping gifts. So just about everything is wrapped. So
And your
I
house is decorated, and your
house
lights
is
are up.
decorated, cards are stamped and
Wow.
out the door. So I am, for me, way behind, but for a normal person, I'm on track with everything to be done before the 25th. So how about you?
Well, I've been slow because it's a compressed uh we have fewer days between Thanksgiving and Christmas, and that kind of threw me. And then we've got all the usual activities, PRI activities, and it's a big our year end is a big fundraising season, so I don't have a lot of time but I'm going to work on it in the next couple of weeks. And my Christmas lasts longer than most because I like to take it all the way to Epiphany. So I can afford to slow down during, December, but really dial it up in over Christmas. So that's where I'm at. But as we slide right into the governor here, so he's got that special session that he's organized, which is, as our Dan Kolke, one of our board members, pointed out in the Orange County Register, it's actually kind of silly because we have the session opens up anyway on December 2nd. So it's a lot of chest thumping on his part actually. So what are you hearing from the special session, Tim?
Well, they made a big fanfare, right? So last Monday was swearing in day. So the new legislature is sworn into office, and it's the day when they can introduce their first bills for the year. Well, certainly, if there's a matter of great urgency that requires a bill be taken up and passed immediately, the legislature can do that. They don't need a special session. The special session as a tool, basically, it allows you to pass a pretty urgent bill with a majority vote of the legislature, and then it takes effect 90 days after the special session closes. Well, in this case, Democrats have a supermajority in the legislature. You think it would be no trouble for them to pass an urgency bill for this funding. Governor wants to provide millions of dollars in additional funding for the Attorney General, and I assume also for whatever outside counsel might be needed to file various litigation against the Trump administration as warranted. You could easily pass that. What Democrat is going to disagree with that in the legislature? So other than for political grandstanding, I just don't understand why we need to go through all this charade. The other thing too that he can do is budget trailer bills, which are the policy bills to enact the budget. Those can be passed by a majority vote, and any changes, any appropriation bills related to the budget, those can also pass on a majority vote. We've changed the law to a majority vote budget. So the bottom line, none of this, the theatrics of a special session was needed. It was just grandstanding on the part of the governor, really. And, we'll see. He says he wants all these bills to be enacted by, I believe it was January 25th. Well, if it's that urgent, you could enacted these the bills to give you additional funding. Could have done it last week. So obviously this is just about getting some headlines rather than a serious push here.
Well, I saw a figure that he wanted to call for $25 million to fund these lawsuits to the Trump administration. And as Dan Kolke wrote, the budget of the Department of Justice is 1.3 billion. You would think that he can find 25 million out of the 1.3 billion, but it's as you say, it's a lot of grandstanding. And Tim, I've also turned on the TV this weekend, and he's making a lot of headlines as far as the Trump tariffs, the potential tariffs to Mexico, 25%. I saw a photo op of him at the border. We're 4 years away from the next presidential election. I think he's got to be careful that the country doesn't get Newsom fatigue.
Well, we're also going to get Newsom fatigue this upcoming spring because the governor is set to release his quote unquote memoirs, which I'm sure will be an anti Trump book. And I think maybe once again my book, The California Left Coast Survivor's Guide, might serve as a good rebuttal to whatever book Gavin Newsom releases. But you're exactly right. He definitely is out guns a-blazing, and he is not going to let Kamala Harris or anyone else get in the way of his presidential aspirations. And I think some of it too is he gets great attention as the governor of California. He's only going to be governor for more than 2 more years. So maybe he's, trying to milk up this opportunity while cameras kind of have to pay him attention. But, I've already got Newsom fatigue and we haven't even started the next campaign.
Well, the 2 years, he's got it. They're critical because he's got a terrible record when you look at the numbers in the state. So if I were him, I would take the next couple of years to shore up employment here. We've got one of the worst unemployment rates in the country. I'd take a look at the crime issues. I'd take a look at the homelessness issues. All of this is going to be in his record, and he's got 2 years to try to turn it around. And if I were him, I'd be concentrating on that rather than try to sue Donald Trump.
And our budget, of course, is still in a precarious situation. And, ironically, Donald Trump will probably help him out on that because if history is a guide, going to generate a lot more tax revenue for the state when Trump is president and more free market policies take hold. But, of course, he could also be practicing the time-honored tradition of pass budget messes to your successor.
So let's move on to our next guest, Adam Abolfazli. He's a high school senior, and he's already a published author. His book is called Permission to Fail: The Decline of School Standards and the Threat to Our Country. Adam attends public school in Sacramento, but he was also a longtime public school student in San Francisco. So we took the time here to interview Adam because, as many of our regular podcast listeners know, we interview a lot of education experts, even, of course, our Lance Zumi, PRI's own education expert. But this is unique in that Adam has a front row seat in the classroom and he can actually tell us what's happening.
When you listen to this episode, you need to keep reminding yourselves this kid is 17 years old. He's just brilliant, certainly very wise, beyond his years, and he makes some very cogent points about the direction of public education in California these days. Unfortunately for him, many of them borne by his personal experiences. So it's a very interesting discussion, and I hope you all enjoy listening and will go out and buy his book because it's definitely worth a read.
Thanks very much. And you've got to remember his name, Adam Abolfazli. And this kid's going places, and we look to a bright future with him. Thanks very much.
We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week.
Welcome to Next Round Podcast, Adam.
Thank you for having me.
So you're a high school senior and you're already an author. So your book is called Permission to Fail, about the decline of academic standards in California's public schools. So you're a great student and will become a success in whatever you do. We all know that. So what compelled you to write this book?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me and for highlighting the book. I think what ultimately compelled me to write it, I always tell people, was like a sense of deep pain, seeing that there's so many people in our schools right now, especially in California, that are struggling. There's so many students that are unmotivated, falling behind, and there's so many teachers and parents also that are frustrated and frankly fed up with the system. Not to mention that our response to COVID just totally decimated schools here in California because we were just so slow and ineffective in how we responded, to the point that within a year we set students back what I think is going to be many years in their lives from that missed year of learning. I mean, if you go back and you look at, the beginning of March 2020, we closed our schools in the state for more than a year, and in some places almost a year and a half. And I understand that we had to follow what guidance was most immediately available, but I think that we're only now fully realizing the effects, the disastrous effects that those COVID times had, which leads to the immediacy of this book. And we kept our students locked up for so long, and instructional time was so reduced so greatly that really no learning was happening. And I'll just say for context, I'm a senior in high school now. This is my 13th year in public schools. But most of that time, even though I live in Sacramento now, was spent in San Francisco Unified. And that was including during the pandemic, in the midst of the school closures and the renaming battles and all that. So, um, basically you have this 13-month plus gap in public education, and in our state, as you know, is very politicized, and then a sudden return. And upon that return is really when I found that there was these drastic changes that had occurred. I mean, many students were showing up rarely, if at all. Many teachers were giving out easy and dumbed down assignments because they knew that students couldn't measure up. There was just there was no excitement for learning, I think is the best way to put it, in that return from COVID. And I remember that in the year returning from the pandemic, there were no signs of life, so to speak, of academic rigor. And it was, this attitude of, just a very lazy, lackadaisical attitude. So like I said, like I write in the book, I was visiting with two of my former teachers from my middle school, actually, and we were all discussing over breakfast these ridiculous policies in education. And I put together an op-ed that was published in the San Francisco Examiner's opinion section, actually, my first of several. And at that point, I just felt there was enough to say for a larger piece. So I started writing essays, kind of a collection of essays on different themes, late work, merit-based admission systems, parent-teacher relationships, just different things. And that really led to what became the book. And those teachers had refreshed my memory on some of the policies in San Francisco Unified, where they completely eliminated letter grades, and they, eliminated merit-based admissions for some high schools. And at that, it's like, come on, talk about a lack of academic rigor. And also I was really disappointed, I should say, by the lack of media coverage of this decline in academic standards in California schools. And I think we covered, the decline in test scores, the learning loss recovery, teacher shortages, mental health issues, a wide range of issues, but the media was failing to connect the dots and show the larger picture of this post-COVID decline. And so that's when I started to write the book.
So let's dive into some of the issues you cover, starting with academic standards. Unlike parents, politicians, and think tankers like us, you've had a front row seat to the current state of academic learning. California and the nation is generally near the bottom of the list when it comes to the academic performance of students in developed countries. So, in your experience in the classroom, why do you think this is the case?
Well, I think that our academic performance, our academic results in California, which, obviously we rank toward the bottom and the country ranks toward the bottom. But I think it's so low because we are so willing to take the easy way out. We have no qualms about accepting mediocrity, and we don't work to prioritize hard results, data-driven results that would represent success in our schools. I mean, it's so much easier for schools to promote themselves on other things that aren't academic standards, and that's what we've seen in the last few years. We see that equity and social justice initiatives are outpacing initiatives to implement academic rigor. We see that we're touting all this infusion of funding for various classes into schools, but we're not focusing on the fundamentals. And I think in California, we can kind of tend to use our diversity of economic industries and our diversity of people as a way, as a cover to avoid fixing that low academic performance because it's really an attitude that focuses more on the end outcome rather than the process. And I think if we were to actually emphasize the process of learning, the results would also be better because all we're doing now is think of schools like an assembly line, moving people along. We have no way of having a bar to so to speak, to ensure that the process is just as intentional as how effective we want academic results to be. If you look at like the State Board of Education, for example, they have long said that grade level proficiency in English and math should be the main goal of California's public schools. And of course, it absolutely should be. But I think we get there through rigorous, effective curricula. We get there with high quality, experienced public school teachers. Um, and the actual end result is only one component. That process is just as important. And we have really recalibrated standards and lowered them even more. And as we've done that, it still doesn't seem to help bring up the test scores. So what's the problem? And I think it's really easy to attack the actual lowering of standards, but then we lower the standards, we make the tests easier, we make the assignments easier, we change the graduation requirements to be easier, and the numbers still don't improve. So how do we explain that? Because, and the way I explain it is that we've really internalized and accepted an anti-rigor attitude. I mean, if you look at the half a dozen California school districts across the state that post-COVID, we're experimenting with eliminating D and F grades and instituting, mandatory minimum C grades. If you look at the push for equity and low standards gradings, if you look at all these schools that, which I write about in the book, all these schools that allow students who fail math and English classes, which are the fundamental classes, which are the benchmarks for academic performance, we look at those scores most heavily. Those students fail those classes in person at their schools, only to then go and take online classes instead that are dumbed down. So the best way to put it is we continue to fail because we haven't cracked down on these policies across the state that actually encourage failure and low performance. And that is why I titled the book Permission to Fail, of course. And I think in other countries and other states, the attitude toward learning, not entirely different, but it's different. And I've actually spoken to and heard from teachers in California um, who previously taught in other places that I actually spoke to inform myself on the book, um, who have all said that the standards, the mindset of achievement of public schools here in California are really lower in comparison to other places. And on that note, I will say that I tried to make it very clear in the book that as a high school student, I don't have all the answers. I wrote it partly to find and seek out the answers, and that's why I talked to so many other students and teachers and parents to inform my own views and my views on what's going on.
So, Adam, you talk about student apathy in your book quite a bit. So, in your experience, are the students in the classroom really apathetic towards learning and achievement? I remember, like in my day, I loved learning. I didn't like sitting in the classroom and doing homework, but as a child, even as an adult, I love to learn. And how do we instill that love of learning to people? And what do you think happened? Why do you think this is the case, this sense of apathy among students?
Well, it's difficult for me to relate to because, like you said about yourself, I am someone who loves to learn, loves the learning process. I have a great value for education and sense of intellectual curiosity, but I think that the majority of other students, they're apathetic because we've really created a culture that allows them to be that way, that, and I'll go as far as saying encourages them to be that way. For example, we've seen that if teachers, administrators, our political leaders, whoever it may be, if they don't value education, why should the students feel that their education should is of value to them? They're sluggish, they're unmotivated, and they're very apathetic. If you just look at the districts here in California that are allowing students to skip many days of school, fully excused for, undiagnosed mental health reasons, or if you look at our leaders in the state, I was just learning in the spring about Assembly Bill 2711, I believe, and thankfully it didn't make it through the Assembly due to a lack of funding, but it was a bill that would have completely banned outright suspensions for drug use at school. And then you see how we have historic, widespread teach shortages of teachers, teacher shortages in the state, where students have no continuity and solid instruction in the classroom, where they're bouncing from teacher to teacher every day without consistency in their education. So if those who control and lead our schools don't take education seriously, then it's like, well, why should the students feel the same way? And I think, of course, there's that everlasting, sluggishness coming out of the pandemic that does play a big part in it. Like I said, we never really fully recovered. And I just don't, that spark for learning, those aha moments, those moments where, a light bulb turns on and students make discoveries or learn to love the process of learning itself, that just doesn't I just don't see that, and that doesn't happen. But I think there's some hope of improvement. In 2026 in California, we're going to be banning cell phones from schools finally, following the great actions of many other states. So hopefully, my hope is that students will begin to interact more with each other, with their teachers, and with the learn process of learning itself, because I think that's also a large part of it, that education has become so automated and isolated. So much of what we do is done in a solitary way on computers, and students aren't interacting with each other. They aren't having face-to-face discussions. And so what can our schools really offer that's exciting to these students? And we have to start thinking of ways to do that so that we can kind of reverse that apathy. And we have to address the very real mental health problems that students are experiencing that clearly are distracting them or holding them back from really unlocking the potential of what their academic careers could be. Because you see schools that succeed because they have students that value high achievement and academic rigor. They succeed so often because students find those things that ignite the spark for learning in them. And I think it's hard, but I think we have to see these kids now, especially post-pandemic, as the victims and not the culprits, because really it's not their fault that they're being moved along in this unserious system. So as a solution, to go back to the previous question, um, they have to be given opportunities that spark that intellectual curiosity, where where they actually have fulfilling experiences that stem and come from intellectual curiosity. And that's why we need to maintain those higher academic standards and why we need to have more academic rigor. That's the number one solution to this problem of apathy.
We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know. Let's move on to parents. You argue in your book that parents are not truly engaged in their children's education. And the pandemic did give parents, of course, a better sense of what their kids were learning or not learning in the classroom when we went through Zoom school and all of that. And it opened the eyes of many parents. But tell us why you think parents aren't engaged in their children's education. And do you think they have too much trust in the system?
Well, it's a good question because I have thought about it and I've said to people that I think parents have have because they don't trust the system, they have not enough trust in our teachers. One of the things that helped me glean some insight into the situation is talking to teachers and parents who are involved, seeing how they view relationships between those parents and those teachers as far as parent involvement and engagement. And I think that there's obviously a growing movement to increase parental rights, undoubtedly motivated, at least in part by the pandemic, where, of course, these parents finally got to see what was happening in the classes firsthand so that we can make things like, a parental bill of rights and just have more insight and accountability for involved parents. But then you have the other side of things where when parents see these very odd district initiatives or new legislation, their best method of advocating for their own students is to turn to their teachers and to turn to the classes that their students are in. If I was a parent and I went on my school district's website and I saw that, the school was eliminating the dress code, and was instituting a policy where every student would get a C and pass every class automatically, no matter what, I would also have some questions myself. But the unfortunate part is that so often that blame gets placed upon teachers for a lot of these larger problems, not realizing that I think in most cases teachers just want to do their jobs. Um, and it's the parents' best recourse to localize a larger problem. But unfortunately, that can strain those relationships between parents and teachers. So in the book, I try to demonstrate that there has to be a balance between parental rights and also a trust in teachers. And I think a better method of engagement would be for those parents to advocate from the top down to really, try to make a change at the higher levels, which is obviously why, work like PRI's school board work is so important, right? Because it's important that each parent engages both with their own children and with the system about what's happening in the classroom, both to alert them to the students' achievements and challenges. But it's a really, really difficult balance to strike when it comes to parent-teacher relationships. And if I'll add, it's just hard for a lot of parents when they see their children struggling to not go and then blame the schools entirely. So I think that we have to find ways for um, parents to be engaged at really the appropriate level, whether that is, talking about parents who are engaged too much or not engaged enough. And there's really a happy medium where we have to bring parents to the table to build a relationship that will support these students in returning to policies of and a mindset of academic rigor because the teachers in the schools, not that they want to do it, but even if they did want to do it, could not um, help implement more academic rigor and academic excellence themselves. The parents are just as much an important part in the process.
So you also write, Adam, that there's a lack of academic rigor in the classroom. What are your observations here? Talk about the content and the testing and the grading. Perhaps you can even give us some examples.
Yeah, well, I actually have a list of changes, really part of what inspired the book I that I was explaining to an education columnist at the Washington Post a few years ago when this whole decline was starting, and he was very interested in the decline of academic rigor, and that's kind of, what led me to recognize that these policies that come both from the top down, district initiatives to say eliminate D and F grades, and then just the mindset of just small class teachers. Um, but I had to really recognize that that was part of a larger pattern. And the ones that come to mind immediately, obviously the examples can be found everywhere, but the biggest one is if you look at how grading is conducted. I mean, I was in a history class where the tests and quizzes were completely eliminated. We had no tests, we had no quizzes, no method of assessment whatsoever. Um, I had a math class where the teacher would add 10 extra points to every single test. And in that same class, there was the teacher would refuse to fail anyone below a 50%. So you got at least a 50%, even though far fewer than 50% of students at that school and in California are proficient in math, for example. So obviously it doesn't line up correctly. Um, I've had other classes where homework was eliminated entirely. I had a humanities class where students were allowed to use their phones to complete the assignments, to look up the answers, and were given full access to notes on every test, every quiz. I was in an advanced English course actually, where just for completing an essay, you would be given full credit. Um, Let's see. I had a science class where students were allowed to retake tests 3, 4, 5 times until, the desired grade was achieved. I was in a foreign language class where all the tests and quizzes were multiple choice. And half of those quizzes were actually graded just on attempting the questions, even if the answer was wrong. And then there's those are the ones from specific classes that come to mind initially. And then there's policies across the board, like, the courtesy, I call it the courtesy C, which is basically that D and F grades are banned in favor of an incomplete or a courtesy C grade. And if you look at the public universities in the state of California, they are looking for a minimum C grade for admission. And then across the board, um, you have the acceptance of the elimination of homework. That's a common theme in most of the classes that I've been in, not all, but most. Accepting late assignments and late work, in actually almost every one of those classes. And sometimes, like in one class, it was up to 3 or 4 months after the initial due date. Um, and at my school a few years ago, I actually surveyed all the teachers and found that the directive from the administrators and the school officials to accept those late assignments without penalty, at least 90% of teachers, per the survey I did, were complying with that directive. So you know that these policies are across the board. And then you say, well, it might just be, and I always would tell myself, well, it's just a policy in one class. It's not really a pattern or a trend. And eventually I had to realize that it is a trend. And it's also a disastrous and detrimental trend because how are students ever going to be prepared for the real world if these policies are implemented? You don't go and get a job and you're allowed to show up late every day. You're allowed to do your work 3 months late and you still get paid your full salary. And that's like, if you want to do a comparison, say, between the salary and the grade, you don't do no work to get a full salary, just like you shouldn't do no work and get a passing grade in a class. So it's all for show, I like to say. It's all very superficial. And like I was saying about academic standards earlier, it's all manufactured in such a way that it looks like, public schools in California are doing great, that we're having these great results, that we're recovering strongly from the pandemic, and it's just not true. So I think people have to look into the individual policies and classes at individual schools and try to connect it back to this larger decline that I really speak of.
So there have been tremendous innovations in the use of technology when it comes to education, but it's certainly all the discussion over cell phones and as you write in your book, that technology might not be necessarily raising the standards of learning. So can you expand on this a little bit?
Sure. Well, yeah, and I actually, because it's so because it's such a relevant right now, and certainly with artificial intelligence, talking about the effect of that in education, that's like the first really main chapter in the book. And I do come out against a lot of this implementation of technology. But I'm not against it. I'm just against the idea that technology can effectively replace either instruction or learning. And I think we have to return to a point, several years ago, before we became so dependent and reliant on it during COVID, where educational technology in classrooms only guides and aids in the learning process rather than replacing it. Um, if you look at programs that school districts have invested heavily in, programs like Kahoot, Edpuzzle, Actively Learn, these are all applications that students have unlimited access to and that teachers rely heavily upon nowadays that really replace the learning process. So if you've ever heard of, I'll give a very specific example. If you've ever heard of the website Actively Learn, it's being used now in a lot of school districts in California are either the teachers are using them themselves or the school districts are actually using part of their budget to purchase contracts where all the teacher with these companies, technology companies, where all the students and teachers get access to them. So it seems great on paper. Actively Learn is basically a website where students, they go and they read books or poetry or articles or novels on their computers online, and embedded into the text, the literature, the content, the material, um, are are entire lessons and entire, modules, units, curriculum. And so you could be writing essays, you could be answering questions, you could be watching videos, all silently within that one website on a computer. And that's basically like it's a fully online class if the teacher chooses to use it that way, and the students are just sitting in the class. And that really, to me, is the definition of replacing the learning process with technology. Sure, there's still these some really good interactive activities going on, but absent are these discussions, pen and paper assignments, holding a book in your hand. There's something special about actually holding a book, holding a pencil, looking at your fellow classmate and discussing some of the greatest literature that there is. And we've really lost that. And then the other side of it is the artificial intelligence. Whereas last year, ChatGPT comes out and schools are railing against the use of it and really trying to crack down on the use of it. Well, the story is different this year. And I have really been looking into a lot of large school districts that are investing in hefty contracts with AI companies um, to allow students and teachers to actually use those programs, which throws into question the legitimacy and value of all work. And I think that artificial intelligence is the antithesis of returning to high academic standards and academic rigor, because it really shows that if you don't have to put any effort into your work and into the learning process, you can just generate all your work. Well, that's not an environment that promotes academic excellence. That's an environment that promotes laziness. So we just have to be careful and toe the line on an appropriate balance between replacing and aiding.
We'll get back to our terrific interview in just a moment, but first, PRI's YouTube channel is must watch. By visiting youtube.com/Pacific Research 1, that's the number 1, you can watch webinars, videos, and other original content, including our new Free City Center video tours and interviews. You can watch as PRI's Wayne Weingarten tours Dignity Moves, a San Francisco nonprofit that is reimagining scalable solutions to homelessness with founder and CEO Elizabeth Funk. And you can check out Stephen Greenhut's tour of a proposed new city in rural Solano County that has generated significant interest and intrigue. You can even listen to previous episodes of Next Round Podcast. So visit PRI's YouTube channel today at youtube.com/Pacific Research 1, that's the number 1, and click the subscribe button to receive notifications about our latest content as soon as it's posted.
Now, we've got to talk about the teachers. Would you give your perspective on why academic standards have declined? Do you think it has to do with teaching methods, teacher attitudes? How about giving us some examples?
Sure. Well, I like to say that I don't want to, criticize teachers, although there are some that, need to be. But I think that we know that younger teachers are less strict. I will say that. There have been studies done by numerous education think tanks and researchers that have shown that younger, less experienced teachers tend to implement less strict policies. We also see that those teachers who don't already have See, a veteran teacher would likely already have the framework for their program and what their curriculum should be in place. But younger teachers are more likely to use dumbed down curriculum that are provided to them by the school districts. And then you should also look at the universities where they're being credentialed and seeing how those universities are or what they're instilling in them. Um, and I think that in general, across the board, there's more apathy among teachers. There's obviously historically low interest in the profession. Fewer people are becoming teachers. Majority of teachers quit within 5 years of getting on the job, or excuse me, a majority of teachers consider quitting within 5 years of getting on the job. And there's just too much politics infused into education, so much more true in California than in other places, where teachers have been caught in the crossfire of these ideological battles to the point where teachers have to worry about how everything they do will be interpreted on a political and ideological level, which is something that I kind of avoided talking about in the book, but I think it's important to mention and understand that teachers can't go back to teaching the fundamentals if they are criticized for doing so, and they can't return to a point of academic standards if they're criticized for doing so for whatever reason. And then teachers just aren't the demands on them are too much. We have this mental health crisis that children are experiencing in our public schools, where the solution to that is to overburden teachers with numerous roles that really distract them from just teaching in their subject. They they are not just supposed to teach, they're supposed to help students recover from learning loss, and they're supposed to collaborate and implement, equity policies and guide students in their mental health struggles, and that burden just becomes too much for a lot of teachers. And so when you have when you have distractions and nothing to really encourage them to really stay strong and stay committed to higher academic standards, it becomes a much more difficult situation. And certainly when just in the last few years in the return from COVID, where there's so many um, there's so many unique challenges that students have experienced, and teachers are always at the forefront of, students' lives, and so they they're the ones that have a front row seat to their students' lives. And when the students are struggling and when the schools are imposing these great burdens on them, it's very difficult for them to do their job. And in return, the academic standards suffer.
Well, finally, Adam, let's talk about solutions. So, if I'm going to make you principal for the day and you're running a high school, tell us what you would do to improve education in your school.
Well, the first thing I would do, if maybe if the job wasn't so political, is I would go to my school district and I would ask them to reinvest, so to speak, their contracts with social emotional learning and social justice organizations into increasing teachers' base salaries. That's the first thing I'd do, pay the teachers more. But of course, that wouldn't happen in the real world. Um, because, like I said, the schools are too concerned and the school districts are too concerned with their appearance. So we've seen hundreds of thousands of dollars in schools in California and school districts in California go into these contracts to bring in people that aren't credentialed teachers into the schools, for social emotional learning, social justice teachings, whatever it may be. That's the first thing that I always say. And then the first academic solution, and it's actually one that I mentioned in the book that I solicited from the teachers that I interviewed and spoke to, is to hire a lot of tutors. The biggest thing that we see is this severe learning loss. And until we make up for that learning loss, we will never be able to get ahead academically. We'll always just be chasing where we were before, and where we were before obviously isn't so great to begin with. Um, so I think simply put, we need tutors. We need them now. And so many teachers say we're overburdened. We can't help students with this learning loss. So we have to have some kind of program that incentivizes and for some students mandates them to receive tutoring services so that, that learning loss can be remediated. Um, and then one I always like to throw out there is that we should be mandating exit exams again. I think exit exams are a thing of the past, once very widely used, of course, but they are an important measure of student progress before moving on, to their next point in their education. So a simple exit exam at the elementary level, then middle and high school levels, I think would really do a lot for seeing where students really are, because it's very easy to manufacture results that come from standardized tests. And I think we need to really have a full picture of where they are before we can even begin to not only move them along in the system, but begin to tackle more solutions. Um, we also need to end this obsession with online classes that are really dumbed down. If you look at school districts that are contracting with local community colleges for students who want to get a head start on those classes, that is a great thing. We should have opportunities for academic excellence. And then we have similar programs that operate under this idea of academic excellence. They say, oh, we are promoting academic excellence by offering additional courses, but they aren't Head Start courses on college classes. Rather, they are dumbed down online classes that the school districts themselves proctor and create that are so much easier. And that references what I said earlier about these students in fundamental classes. When they fail those classes in person at a school, they can still go for the same credit to an online class that's dumbed down. And then there's smaller things like um, bringing back homework, um, encouraging enrollment in AP and advanced classes, eliminating the acceptance of late work. I think that we should have some sort of standard for a minimum balance between learning on, with books and textbooks and paper and learning on a computer. Um, and one of the things that strikes me as the most important with talking about parent engagement and involvement is that so much of technology has automated and digitized um, things that most commonly appear online. So now we see all the grades are inputted online. And I think it's time where school districts return to a point where they were mailing home grade reports, mailing home progress reports, because then it forces the parents to see, um, this is how my child is doing. And if it's online, they're less likely to look at that. Um, and lastly, we need to encourage that academic excellence. We need to have programs that encourage merit. We need to have the classes and the teachers that can spark curiosity and into feelings of intellectual reward in students. And obviously that's easier said than done, but there are those small policies, anything from grades to tests to homework and attendance policies, where you just start at the small local school level and you work your way up from there. And I think that is where the solutions are going to be. Individual classes, individual families, individual smaller school districts that begin to implement either reverse disastrous policies or implement small policies that will lead to gradual change in our academic mindset.
Well, thank you, Adam. If more students were like you, we would have tremendous faith in the future of our country. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.